All right, what's going on, everyone? So today we're going to take a look at some updates around the ongoing war in Ukraine. We're going to start with some battlefield updates using Deep State Map. I'll go ahead and pull that up here. We're going to shift over to some Trump statements about the war. Still pretty unknown the direction he's going to take in this conflict, but we are going to see how one of his most recent executive orders may or may not influence future aid shipments to Ukraine. We're going to take a look at some recent conversations about the increasing likelihood of European troops or Western troops in general arriving on the battlefield, that possibility. There's a story recently that just came out talking about Russian filtration camps, which, look, at baseline is a pretty disgusting story, but it is a part of this conflict, so we're going to get into that. And then we'll wrap up with, I guess, our favorite Russian doom poster, Igor Girkin. He's pro-Russian, wants Russia to win this war, and just came out earlier today venting that they've lost in every way, shape, and form. Always an interesting take from Girkin. Now, all of these resources will be linked in the description below, starting with Deep State Map here, a publicly available resource. So looking at the overall map of Ukraine to kind of give you an idea of what we're looking at here, the dark red or purplish, if you will, down here in the south with Crimea and over here in Donetsk and Luhansk, these are areas occupied by Russia in 2014. The orangish areas is territory of Ukraine occupied by Russia since 2022. The green is territory once occupied by Russia since liberated by Ukraine. Now, the area we're going to focus in on today is down here in the south, namely Velika Novoselka. This name might sound familiar. It's a small town, village, if you will, but it might sound familiar to people who have been following the war because this was the location of pretty significant offensive activity during Ukraine's push south back in the summer of 2023. So this was one of the territories that they liberated, and there's a lot of fighting in and around this direction, showing the progress of Ukraine in the south. As of today, January 23rd, 2025, it looks like Velika Novoselka is on the brink of falling to Russian forces entirely. Now, there's some speculation. One of the major concerns here is the Ukrainian forces that might still be trapped on the verge of being cut off here in Velika Novoselka. And you can see how that might play out, right? With Russian forces advancing in two directions. You can see the main road coming in and out of this town appears to now be under Russian control. So anybody wanting to flee at this point would have to do so at least over one body of water. It's getting harder and harder to actually leave this area. It's going to be an area worth keeping an eye on here. But this is generally how Russian forces have fought this war for quite a while. Like the last major head-on assault, if you will, major one at least, was in Bakhmut. And if you recall that offensive, which to give you an idea, the orientation here is a little bit up here to the northeast. So we've got Bakhmut up here. Generally speaking, the Wagner forces here led the charge directly head-on into the Ukrainian defenses. They did take the city over time at a significant cost of lives. So what we've seen change since then is more of these pincer type movements, if you will, where, and Velika Novoselka actually shows it pretty well. I'm going to go back, let's see, we'll go back to early December here. Let's go back mid-December, try to give you an idea. So here you can see instead of charging head on, the Russian forces are kind of coming from the south and the northeast. By the end of the month, see how they're advancing, but the front hasn't really changed here. And you'll see they'll slowly advance and kind of encircle that location until, eventually the Ukrainian forces are forced to withdraw. And this is actually something that we've seen a lot of pushback on against the chain of command inside of Ukraine at this point. It's played out at a couple different locations. One of the more recent ones was actually over here in Volodar, which now seems like a lifetime ago. But in Volodar, something similar played out, where the Russians managed to push to the east and the west, slowly encircle that town, and then eventually Ukrainian forces had to withdraw. So the big question right now around Velika Novoselka is not if it will fall. Clearly it will, just looking at how this map is played out right now. It's how many Ukrainian forces are remaining in that pocket. There is going to be some sort of rear guard to try to slow the Russian advance so other elements can evacuate the city. And that's generally what we've seen for a long time in this conflict. There haven't been dozens or even hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers that are captured when something like this falls. But there is always the question of how worth it was it to leave that rear guard in place and not evacuate earlier, essentially, and pull back to a maybe more fortified secondary or tertiary position. Now, what's interesting right now is we're seeing a lot of focus on Vilka-Novoselka, understandably so. Relatively small, not all that strategically important. The strategically important area is just up here to the northeast, Pokrovsk. Now, this isn't getting nearly as much attention right now, but we are starting to see more of an encirclement take place here. Again, to go back to our map, at the beginning of the month, you can see the Russian forces, it's slow and at a very heavy cost around Pokrovsk. But if we go back, let's go to November 1st. You can see the progress that's already been made since November. And rather than attacking Pokrovsk head on, we'll kind of skip a few days at a time here. Kind of a cheap man's time lapse, if you will. You'll see how they've slowly but surely kind of expanded around the city in an aim of eventually cutting this off entirely. So now I'm moving through January up to today. So you can see the issue here where there's a couple major concerns for the Ukrainian forces now at Pokrovsk, cutting off the supply lines to the west and to the east. Now, to the east, the concern here would be shutting off any sort of cooperation, coordination to elements over here in Toretsk, New York, all the way up into Chasiv Yar and Bakhmut. There is still a line open through Kramatorsk, but it would essentially sever any major lines of communication to the east of Pokrovsk. The other issue here is just to the west. So this is arguably more important because if this is cut off, you can see how it affects major supply routes coming in to reinforce and resupply a good chunk of the eastern front in Ukraine. So we are still seeing Russian advances near Pokrovsk and Vilka-Novoselka, kind of the two major areas to keep an eye on right now. Ukraine, of course, is still operating in the Kursk region up here. No major changes in the last few weeks, really. The last major operation, Ukraine pushed in, was able to capture a couple North Korean soldiers alive, which was pretty important in this war, all things considered, to be able to show that they actually are there fighting. But right now, the operation in Kursk is generally just like a major annoyance for Russia. I would say it is costing them men and equipment, but over and over in Russian media, this is kind of the sore point. Saying, hey, we are advancing in other areas, but what the hell is going on in Kursk? Why can't we get the Ukrainians out of our own territory? Now, shifting over to some of the news topics here, we have seen President Trump newly sworn into the oath of, or recently sworn in as the President of the United States. He's referenced the war a couple different times now, and it's been incredibly challenging to figure out exactly where he's going to fall on this issue. Is he going to send more weapons? Is he going to cut down the weapons supply? He did put out I guess it's called a truth, right? Is that the right way to phrase this? I'm just going to read directly from that. I'm not on Truth Social, but the benefit of X is people take his posts from there. That's like his personal or his social media company that he owns, and people publish those on X. So that's where I find it. But I thought this one was worth going through directly. This is kind of his biggest statement, Trump's biggest statement directed at this war, but it's also like only directed at Russia. You'll notice Ukraine isn't actually mentioned in this statement at all. Interpret that however you will. But nonetheless, this was notable. Trump put out this statement, quote, "I'm not looking to hurt Russia. I love the Russian people and always had a very good relationship with President Putin. And this despite the radical left's Russia hoax. We must never forget that Russia helped us win the Second World War, losing almost 60 million lives in the process. All that being said, I'm going to do Russia, whose economy is failing, and President Putin a very big favor. Settle now and stop this ridiculous war. It's only going to get worse. If we don't make a deal soon, I have no other choice but to put high levels of taxes, tariffs, and sanctions on anything being sold by Russia to the United States and various other participating countries. Let's get this war, which never would have started if I were president, over with. We can do it the easy way or the hard way. The easy way is always better. It's time to make a deal. No more lives should be lost." Now, I will note that it seems like Trump has been very open to speaking to Putin since coming into office. There's no indications that that has happened or that it's even technically scheduled at this point, but it does seem to be trending in that direction, that there's going to be direct lines of communication to try to bring about some sort of agreement. Now, I should note that on Russian Telegram channels right now, there's kind of a panic because they don't know what to expect. And again, that might be a positive, might be a negative. We know that here in the United States, Trump tends to be erratic. You wake up one morning and he's said or done something that was completely unexpected. The Russians are a little bit nervous about that. So they generally knew what to expect day in and day out under the Biden administration, and they kind of looked at a Harris administration as being the same, which I think is it's a pretty fair assessment. Probably would have been very similar in terms of their policies regarding this war. they don't know yet what to make of Trump. There has been a couple of the channels talking about how sanctions don't matter. They've been able to overcome all the sanctions so far, so these threats aren't really anything. And other Russian Telegram channels, kind of prominent mill bloggers, worried that the other side of this or else, if Putin doesn't agree to come to the table and kind of limit some of his demands, the or else is the U.S. might pump additional weapons in Ukraine to try to give Zelensky the upper hand in the near term. So very uneasy responses in Russian media right now. Now, one thing that they actually pointed to in favor of, and is a little confusing, are one of the Trump executive orders around foreign aid. They just put this out on January 20th. Trump signed this executive order titled Reevaluate and Realigning United States Foreign Aid. And when you get into the Russian channels, they're all saying this means right out the gate that Trump is shutting down any and all aid to Ukraine, at least for the next 90 days, which would be a major detriment to the Ukrainian war effort. So some Russians are seeing that as a positive sign. I'm not sure that's what this actually means, but we're getting into some of this, economic warfare and stuff that's a little bit outside my realm of expertise. So I went over to the Kyiv Independent, actually ran a pretty good article on this, titled What Trump's 90-Day Pause on U.S. Foreign Development Assistance Means for Ukraine. And right out the gate, they quote, the newly appointed Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. Dude got, I think, 99 out of 100 possible votes. So like everybody in the Senate is on board with Marco, who said, quote, under President Trump, the top priority of the United States Department of State will be the United States. The direction he has given for the conduct of our foreign policy is clear, Rubio said before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee last week. Every dollar we spend, every program we fund, every policy we pursue must be justified by the answer to one of three questions. Does it make America safer? Does it make America stronger? Or does it make America more prosperous? For what it's worth, I think that, related to the war in Ukraine, it's just going to be a matter of framing, because each one of those arguments can be made looking at the threat of Russia and what they've done in this war so far. The idea of standing with our allies in Eastern Europe, even if they're not NATO allies. Ukraine is still an ally of the United States. So all of those questions can be answered in the affirmative to continue aid. It'll just be interesting to see how Rubio's State Department and other entities in the U.S. government now frame those answers and how that impacts aid going forward. Now, they did lean on an expert here, Archer Koldometsov. We're going to try that again. Archer Koldometsov. I know I butchered that. Look, pronunciations at baseline are pretty rough. When it's purely English, it's pretty rough. But they say he's a Ukrainian expert on U.S. politics. He doesn't think this is going to have much of an impact at all. He says in the context of this particular decision, it's quite difficult to imagine the implementation of this idea since the funds allocated for these initiatives have already been distributed, and the next budget will be adopted in September. He said it is possible that this could impact USAID type funds. So what he's getting at there is the idea that a lot of the aid that has been so the stuff that's already been distributed has been distributed. There's nothing to do about that. But the funds have already been allocated. So this isn't a matter of like the U.S. sits down tomorrow and says, hey, we should send $10 billion to Syria next year because they have a new government. We like Jelani and we want to help them with reconstruction. He's saying that would need to go through this new agreement of figuring out, does it, A, B, and C benefit the United States? But the current tranche of money that has been set aside has already been allocated, so that wouldn't be affected. Honestly, I could see that being playing out kind of in either direction, but it will be something to keep an eye on. Then shifting over to this conversation about troops on the ground, I've already seen people take this in wildly different directions. Some, of course, because it's good clickbait, I guess, said, breaking news, U.S. to put boots on the ground, and it's supported by Europe. That's a bit of a stretch, a pretty disingenuous stretch, if you ask me. So this conversation has been had for a long time. There are some noticeable changes here, but by and large, before getting into this, I think it's worth mentioning that across NATO as an alliance, there is no appetite right now for fighting a war against Russia in Ukraine. Like as a NATO alliance, there's just no appetite for that. In the United States, there's no appetite for it. I don't know if that number has changed or decreased since Trump came into office a couple days ago, or maybe since he won the election a little over a month ago. But I've never seen the number in terms of support here in the United States for U.S. boots on the ground in Ukraine. I think the highest I ever saw was like 25%. So that support is not there. It's not a realistic conversation at this point. What this article gets into is in recent conversations, Ukrainian President Zelensky talked about how they would need upwards of 200,000 troops at a minimum in order to kind of keep a buffer zone, right? In the case of a ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia. Some Ukrainian officials think that number is actually closer to 40 and 50,000 foreign troops operating across a security fence across a 1,000-kilometer front line, and they say that could be feasible, according to people familiar with the discussions. But here's the thing. This is very broad, talking about Western troops in general, and there's a couple different conversations being had here. Are these troops going there to fight against Russia, or are they going there to enforce a ceasefire, right? That's very different mission sets they could be allocated for. Now, one thing they mentioned that I thought was interesting here was saying so far only the Baltic states have signaled support for the idea, as long as it is a broader mission with other allies. Poland has ruled out sending troops and insists that it should not be NATO's border states with Russia that are involved with troops on the ground. And again, to go back to this idea, there's just no broad support across NATO to do this. And I do actually think it's a viable option for some of these countries. I don't think it's out of the cards that you see countries like Poland or Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, you pick, of these NATO countries could very easily put together some sort of, foreign legion, if you will, to go fight in Ukraine under the flag of their individual country. This is where some confusion around NATO tends to come up, and I think it's worth diving into. So let's say in this instance, we'll go with Latvia. Latvia says, we're going to put together a battalion, 500 to 1,000 soldiers, along with their equipment. They're going to wear the Latvian flag, and they're going to go to Ukraine and serve in the southern portion of the country, helping defend Kherson against the Russian drone and artillery attacks, right? They can do that. That does not automatically, that would be an issue between Latvia and Russia. That is not a NATO and Russia thing. These countries, all of the NATO countries, can operate independently outside of NATO. There's no restrictions on that at all. Every action that the United States takes is not a NATO action. Every action that Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania take is not a NATO action. Now, I understand the pushback there would be people arguing Article 5. Wait a minute, they go into Ukraine and they're going to fight against Russia, and the minute they get shot at or take incoming fire, they're going to say Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all. Article 5 is not automatic, all right? So all member states have to vote in favor of adopting Article 5 or enforcing Article 5. So any one of these countries could decide that they're going to go to war in Ukraine to fight against Russia, and that there's no way, if that were to happen, that all member states would say, well, wait a minute, that's definitely an attack on your troops. Now we have to go to war, and we're forced into a broader conflict with Russia. So all of that to say, don't rule out entirely the possibility of some, especially Baltic states, maybe putting troops on the ground in Ukraine and being upfront about it. Like genuinely wearing their flags on their shoulders, not trying to hide it as some, Ukrainian version of Little Green Men. Now, transitioning over to this filtration camp story, which is just disgusting, but again, it's a part of this war, so I feel like it's worth talking through. We have a thread that I'm going to run through, put together here by Ina Mariupolska, who she says is a resident of Mariupol, survived the destruction of the city while being in it, witness of the crimes of the Russian armed forces in Mariupol, and considers and says that she is a refugee. So this was all put together in like a thread reader that I'll run through here, a little easier to work through. This first picture here is from, April 16th, 2022, just outside of Mariupol. I should mention filtration camp, think filtering of citizens. It's not quite the same as a concentration camp. Think of a concentration camp as like the last step. Filtration is like moving through, identifying where the citizens are going to go, like based off of their past or their relationships, their current jobs, ideologies, things like that, any number of reasons. And we'll get into some of those here in a minute. But in this case, they would either be sent off to work camps or military prisons or maybe back into Ukraine, into certain portions of Russia, whatever it might be. So they're filtering through the citizens. Second picture here, they talk about the numbers allocated to the individuals. Her number was 331, saying that her children's were 332 and 333. And then the location, her son Andrew, in one of the filtration camps. So they did move them into Russian territory, and she actually shows a previous 6-year-old video picture of that same area to show this is where that filtration took place. Looks like a school gym. He talks about how few possessions they're able to take, which, again, a good example here, I think, is actually going back to, you hate to compare everything to the Holocaust or World War II, but it's probably a pretty good example when you're looking at these filtration camps, right? Because the Russians are forcing these citizens out of their homes, saying you can only take so many things. And she says this is the possessions for 10 people, right? That's nothing for those individuals. And then, maybe they get to keep that as they continue on their journeys. Well, let's go ahead and start with what this process actually looks like. She said all men are forced to undress on the spot to check if they have Ukrainian tattoos on their bodies. If they find tattoos, you're finished. It's not clear what finished means. We just, unfortunately, today saw more footage of Ukrainian POWs surrendering, being moved around on the battlefield, and then executed by Russians on the spot. So you can't rule that one out, unfortunately, at any point. In this case, it also could mean going directly to prison or a work camp. She says soldiers in masks will arrive to take you to a place like Olnivka or the Tangarog pretrial detention center to a torture chamber. Again, my apologies in the pronunciation. Trying my best, but they're pretty rough at times. Women will also be searched physically, but later in the common washroom in the filtration camp. A Russian woman will simply come in there and look at you as you wash. If you have Ukrainian tattoos on your body, everything will be very bad. Let's say you don't have any tattoos, like me, and there are no marks that could be considered marks from wearing a bulletproof vest and bruises from a rifle butt. Then you move on to the next level. So essentially, they're looking for anything that could indicate that you might have at some point been involved in fighting back against the Russians. There are methods that we would use in Iraq and Afghanistan where you can test kind of on the spot for gunpowder residue, because a lot of times what we would have is somebody would fire rounds at us and then they'd set the AK down and go back to farming. And there was no way to prove definitively on the spot that, wait a minute, I'm pretty sure you were just shooting at me. So we had these gunpowder tests, which isn't new technology by any stretch, and you could put it in their hands and say, like, you did just fire a weapon. So it's like that, just like a less advanced version, I guess. If they have marks on their body that look like body armor, or the rifle butt, as in they were firing and it left some sort of bruise in the pocket there. They say first you were taken to a special interrogation room. In our case, it was the Veselo-Voneska checkpoint in the Rostov region. Rostov is in Russia. The room is the size of a provincial bus station. There are rows of iron seats. Here you have to wait for the call for interrogation. There are about 300 of us in the room, 6 buses with 50 people each. At the end of the hall, there are 3 doors. Next to one of them, there are sockets and many phone chargers. You are told to charge your phones in advance because they will be searched, especially carefully, and all information will be copied from there to the FSB officer's computer. It's interesting that they're told they're going to be searched, because you got to imagine they're going through there. There's probably some numbers and contacts or whatever that you're just mass deleting, right? If you had an uncle that at one point was in the Ukrainian military, if I were in their shoes, I'd be like, well, got to delete that number, not messing around with that. Anything at all that could be possibly suspect, you have to think people would be just removing from their devices. They say, why did you save this? God forbid there will be a picture about politics with your criticism of Russians. God forbid something like this will be found on your Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. If you have even a glimpse of Ukrainian symbols or the uniform of the armed forces of Ukraine in your photos, it'll be bad. Even for a photo from a long time ago. Several years before the full-scale oath of allegiance of a brother, FSB officers brought one girl to hysteria and a nervous breakdown. This girl was saved from being sent to Olivinka only because she was a child of about 17 years old, and her brother's photo was really old. In another situation, my neighbor's sister ended up in Olivka. She had a photo of a guy in a Ukrainian military uniform on her phone. That's all it took down in Mariupol, was like any association at all, according to these accounts. And these people were filtered off to, again, work camps, prisons, or others. They said there will be an interrogation based on the list on your telephone contacts. The FSB officer will transfer them to his computer and start checking them in his database. If your friend or relative is entered into this Russian database of disloyal persons, you'll be interrogated about your relationship and why you have this number written down. The most important of the first questions during interrogation: are you or your close relatives a Ukrainian civil servant, military, SBU, prosecutor, court employee, Ukrainian police officer? If the answer is yes to at least one question, you are taken somewhere else, probably to every time I'm getting this wrong, Olenivka. In Olenivka, what was set up was not a filtration camp, but literally a concentration camp for Ukrainians. If, let's say, you cleared your phone of dangerous information in time, you don't have any suspicious contacts, correspondence where you speak disloyally about Russians and messengers, you don't have relatives in the army, and on this side, everything is clean. The interrogation stops, and the actual filtering begins. So moving into the essence of filtering now, they say. So again, at this point, I understand how people might look at this and say, Well, yeah, you want to sift through these refugees, if it's not really the appropriate term here. They've been captured, they've been taken by Russians. But if you have a large group of civilians, it's totally understandable in any military force to want to go through there and identify, are there any spies? Are there any like clear government employees? Are there any members of the military? Like, yes, 100% you're going to want to do that. This is taking it 78 steps further than that of, do you happen to have any contacts in your phone of anybody who at any point throughout history may have been associated with the Ukrainian military? Have you ever said anything that could be considered disloyal to Russia? Remember, these people didn't live in Russia. They lived in a country, Ukraine, next to Russia. But if they had said something in the past disloyal to Russia, they were filtered out. Think about that. They say to understand where exactly you will be sent in exile in Russia is virtual slavery. Therefore, filtering begins with a question about education, profession, work experience, skills, and abilities. This is a bit like a job interview. The most popular among Russians were IT specialists, technicians, and blue-collar workers. Our friend was a janitor in Mariupol, and she even wore a janitor's uniform during the filtration procedure. The lady passed the filtration in 5 minutes. They told her that janitors were needed in Russia and sent her to work somewhere in Ufa. Mechanics, electricians, crane operators, they passed this filtration interrogation quite easily. After it, the person was sent to a filtration camp to await distribution, in which region of Russia would be sent for forced labor. For example, the stepmother of my distant relative was sent somewhere near Tver to a half-ruined sanitarium to work there as a housekeeper for 2,000 rubles a month, plus a bed and lunch. She saved money from this meager salary for many months in a row in order to escape from there. The train ticket costs about 10,000 rubles. So this continues on, but it kind of gives you the idea. Forced labor, slave labor in a sense, of tens of thousands of Ukrainians, maybe more, being sent from Mariupol to various portions all across Russia. And of course, this is one account of that happening. It kind of leads you to believe that in other areas where Russia came in and occupied the territory quickly while there still were civilians on the ground, that this is likely what took place there as well. Now, shifting over to a recent post from, this one's highlighted here by Dimitri over at War Translated, Igor Girkin, who is kind of the favorite, if you will, pro-Russian pessimist, I think is the best way to put it. This dude wants Russia to win the war, and he is livid day in and day out that they're not. In fact, he was jailed not all that long ago. Actually, it was kind of a while ago. He's put in prison for essentially for these points of view, and he's still firing him off whenever he gets the chance. And he had an interesting one that just came out earlier today, talking about reflections on what would be better not to happen for the year 2025. He says the situation for the Russian Federation is characterized as negative. By the end of the third year of the war, none of the objectives previously declared as goals of the special military operation have been achieved or are close to being achieved. 1. The Zelensky regime has not been overthrown and is holding stronger than in 2022. Under the war, the accelerated de-Russification of Ukraine has continued. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarch has been reformed. The Nazi propaganda has brainwashed the population, and hatred for Russia has not only failed to diminish, but has grown many times over. That last point, I mean, is interesting, right, across the board, but like if you look at how Ukrainians view Russians, it's drastically different today across the board as a whole than it was before the war started. That's not to say there were a lot of kind feelings in one direction or another, but the amount of hatred right now is magnitudes higher because Russia is at war with them and lobbing missiles and drones into Ukrainian territory daily and killing Ukrainian civilians and soldiers on a daily basis. Like, the anti-Russian sentiments across Ukraine have spiked directly due to this war. So that's point one that Girkin points to. Second, no demilitarization of Ukraine has been achieved. And this is something we've talked about before on this channel. He says, on the contrary, there is now a massive grouping, several 100,000 strong, in front of our lines, armed possibly better than before the start of the war. Well-organized, experienced, resilient, and despite war fatigue, showing no signs of imminent collapse. Part of this grouping is conducting combat operations on the territory of Russia's old regions in the Kursk region, from which our forces have been unable to oust the enemy for over 4 months. The armed forces of Ukraine are intensifying missile and drone attacks on the deep rear of our troops, reaching as far as the Volga and beyond, hitting industrial and infrastructure facilities on a scale that grows month by month. So there's a lot there. But it's an interesting aspect. There's some great memes, if you will, if there can be good memes in the middle of a war, where it shows Russians complaining about, like, what the hell is going on? Why are there drones striking in Moscow and in portions of Russian territory? And it's like, what did you expect, right? Like, you start a war on your border and you start slinging missiles and drones into populated centers in Ukraine, like, at some point that's going to come home. And it's not one-to-one, right? The volume and the size of munitions flying in the two directions, but it's picked up a lot. There's a lot more Ukrainian munitions going boom in Russia today than there were in 2022, and it's not even close. On top of that, this demilitarization argument from Russia, I feel like, has to be dispelled at this point, right? The Ukrainian military right now is arguably the strongest and most effective military in Europe. Like, make the argument against that right now. I think they have more troops in uniform than any other European nation. When you look at now, in terms of quantity of equipment, it's probably smaller than some countries like Germany and the United Kingdom. But when you get into the tactics and the battlefield experience and how these guys are fighting a modern war, like, Ukraine genuinely might be the number one European military right now. So good job, Russia. Just like you pulled a bunch of countries into NATO by invading Ukraine, this invasion has also prompted kind of the rebuilding of the Ukrainian military into a pretty significant force, an outsized force for what the country was before this war. He says, third, the territories of the new regions, except for the Luhansk People's Republic, have not been liberated from the enemy. The adversary continues to firmly hold the capital and the right bank of the Kherson region, the capital and a significant part of the Zaporozhye region, and substantial territories of the Donetsk People's Republic. Our success in the Kharkiv region are minimal and remain purely tactical. There is no chance at all constitutional territories of the Russian Federation can be liberated militarily in the near future. So I'm actually going to go, and then to sum up, the SMO, Special Military Operation, in the form which has begun, has failed. It has not achieved its stated objectives. I'm actually going to go back to a map here to show you the areas he's talking about, because this is important. So towards the start of the war, there were 4 territories. You had Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Luhansk. And when he's saying nothing but Luhansk has been taken, you can see all of Luhansk now is under the control of the Russian military. Down here at Donetsk, there's still a good chunk of Donetsk that is currently occupied by Ukraine. Occupy is probably not the right word because it's their territory to begin with. Ukrainian forces are still in a large portion of Donetsk. Same with Zaporozhye. A large portion of that still under Ukrainian control. Same with Kherson. Large portion still under Ukrainian control. The reason Girkin is upset about that is because there was a referendum where Russia a couple of years ago said, hey, these territories are now Russian territory. They belong to Russia. So he's frustrated, saying, you claimed these as Russian. You said they belong to Russia. So clearly there has to be some sort of priority of taking this territory, and we still haven't. Again, looking at the amount of territory here that remains in Ukraine's hands, all of that is what Girkin is upset about. But either way, a little longer video today. I thought it was worth diving into some of these storylines as well as the battlefield update. So let me know what you think. That's all I got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.